So we're just going to review real quick, so we're fully aware of President Jackson's Indian policy. Remember I told you yesterday that really President Jackson had a true belief that Indians were primitive people. That was his view on it. And he truly believed, it wasn't something to be mean I don't think, but I think he truly believed that these Indian tribes that were living east of the Mississippi River would be much better off on lands west of the Mississippi. They could continue their way of life, or if they wanted to gradually accept the white man's way of life, they could do that. But he truly believed that was best for them. Now, because of that, Congress passed, with his encouragement, the Indian Resettlement Act of 1830. And the act stated for the removal of Indian tribes from lands east of the Mississippi River to lands west of the Mississippi River. And Indian tribes would be asked to sign removal treaties. And if they signed that removal treaty, then they would agree to move the lands west of the Mississippi, and they would be assisted by the American military in a peaceful manner to be taken to what they considered Indian country, or Indian territory. Well, what happened is, at first, some of the Indian tribes resisted this Indian Resettlement Act. The most notable were the Sauk Indians and the Fox Indians. They lived on the Wisconsin-Illinois border. And in 1832, because of their resistance, military forces were sent in against those two tribes in what became known as the Black Hawk War. And the Indians, who were led by Chief Black Hawk, fought bravely against the military, but were eventually overwhelmed and forced into Indian territory. Now, we also mentioned yesterday that back in the southeastern part of the United States, there were many tribes that had begun the process of adapting to the white man's way of life. And 5 tribes in particular that became known as the 5 civilized tribes, which were the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole, all decided that they would adapt themselves to the white man's way of life, become civilized and organized, and that's where they got the name 5 civilized tribes. Now, all 5 of those tribes were asked to sign the removal treaties with the federal government, agreeing that they would move to lands west of the Mississippi River, and 3 of the 5 tribes agreed and signed the treaties: the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw. Now, after these 3 tribes signed those removal treaties, where were they first taken before they were actually moved peaceably?
The Creeks had first, so they got moved right away, and the other 2 were forced.
Yeah, they put them into concentration camps and waited to move them, and several of the Indians never made it out of the camps. They died before they ever left because of the poor conditions. Well, from 1830 to 1840, the Creeks, the Chickasaws, and the Choctaws were eventually moved to lands west of the Mississippi River after signing those removal treaty agreements. However, the Seminoles and the Cherokee Indians refused to sign those treaties, and that took us to the subtopic of the fate of the Cherokee Indians, and we got a little ways through there, and I'll kind of go through it again. The Cherokee tribe really did their best to adapt to the white man's way of life, with the hopes that they could stay put where they were rather than have to move. And we gave you some examples of how they became organized and civilized. They had developed their own written language. They had published their own newspaper in their own language. They had supported and built schools for their own children. They even governed themselves under a written constitution which included their own laws, law enforcement, and judicial system. And they were hoping that their efforts in those areas to adapt to the white man's way of life might allow them to stay on their native lands in Georgia. Unfortunately, an event would occur in their native lands in Georgia that would crush that dream and change their lives forever. And we mentioned yesterday that gold had been discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia. White settlers were set to swarm into the area to find their fortune in gold. And knowing that a swarm of white settlers into Indian lands would result in nothing but bad, an uprising, the state government tried to force the tribe to sign the removal treaty. We talked about that, right? Did they agree to do so? No. And when they refused to sign the removal treaty, what did the government do? Threatened to take their land. Now, we mentioned yesterday that most people think when a threat like that would be made to take their land, that the Indians would act in a violent manner. We would have a a war, a Cherokee War, and the winner take all. In this case, to show you how civilized and organized the Cherokee tribe was, they actually appealed that decision by the state government of Georgia all the way to the Supreme Court. And Supreme Court Justice John Marshall is going to decide the fate of the Cherokee Indian land. It's going to be put in the hands of John Marshall. So rather than take a violent approach to solving this possible seizure of their lands by the state government of Georgia, the organized, civilized Cherokee tribe appeals that decision all the way to the Supreme Court. So it will be Chief Justice John Marshall that will decide their fate. Now, let's think about this a minute. What he's trying to decide is if the state of Georgia has any jurisdiction over the tribe. If they have jurisdiction over the tribe, could they take their land? Yes. If they don't have jurisdiction over their tribe, could they take their land? No. So what is he really deciding? He's deciding if Indians are what of the United States? Citizens. Because if they're citizens of the state, and the state wants to take their land, that would probably be okay. They could justify doing that. But if Marshall deems them not to be citizens in their own nation, so to speak, or their own state, would Georgia have a right to take their lands? No. How do you think Marshall rules? Anybody want to take a shot? Does he rule for the Indians or against them? How many think he rules for them? In other words, they get to keep their lands. How many think he rules against? Usually about 50-50. Surprisingly, he ruled for the Cherokee Indians. He said that the state of Georgia had no jurisdiction over the tribe, and as a virtue of that, could not take their lands. Which basically he's stating what? Are they citizens of Georgia? No, they're their own entity, and they can't take their land. So, that's how John Marshall ruled. That the state of Georgia had no jurisdiction, they could not take the land that belonged to the Cherokee of Georgia. How did Georgia officials react to that, Jordy? Not good, and they actually, Jordan, ignored the Supreme Court ruling and continued their actions against the Cherokee. They just ignored the ruling. They ignored the ruling. So who would have to step in on behalf of the Cherokee next? Who could they maybe appeal to? Who would have the most power in the land? The president. And do you think Andrew Jackson would be in favor of that? No way, right? So Jackson also refused to abide by the Supreme Court ruling, stating this, quote, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." So he basically said, you know what, Chief Justice Marshall, if you think these Indians have a right to that land and you don't want the state of Georgia to take it, then you enforce the law because I am not going to do it. You get what I'm saying here? So if you're the Cherokee Indians, you're kind of between a rock and a hard place, aren't you? You see any light at the end of the tunnel that you're going to be able to keep your lands? When the Supreme Court rules for you, but the state of Georgia will not follow the Supreme Court decision, and neither will the President of the United States, who says, quote, "Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Okay? So, Carter, you're one of several Cherokee leaders. You've heard the Supreme Court ruling, you've seen the ramifications of that. What might be your best choice in the best interest of your tribe? Just go. That's exactly right, because Cherokee leaders thought, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. This is never going to work. We have no support. So in the best interest of the tribe, they signed the removal treaty agreements. And they did that in 1835. 1835. So despite the Supreme Court ruling, Cherokee leaders had no choice. Finally, in 1835, Cherokee leaders agreed to sign the removal treaty. What did they want in exchange for signing? A guarantee that they would be what? Moved peacefully. without violence, to protect the tribe. We'll agree to go, even though the Supreme Court says we don't have to. We'll go, but we want to guarantee that we will be transported peacefully. You're not going to throw us in concentration camps before we go. We want to go peacefully. Okay? Now that treaty, that agreement between the federal government and the Cherokee tribe became known in history as the Treaty of New Echota. The Treaty of New Echota. And that was the agreement between the government and the Cherokees that they would agree to sign those removal treaties in exchange for a guarantee of a peaceful relocation to lands west of the Mississippi. That was called the Treaty of New Echota. Now, unfortunately for the Cherokee, there was one lone holdout, one Cherokee leader that did not want to abide by this move. His name was John Ross. Cherokee Chief John Ross was the lone holdout. He had about 20,000 men, women, and children that followed him, that were loyal to him. And John Ross and his 20,000 Cherokee men, women, and children refused to sign the relocation agreement, refused to be moved. So many Cherokee Indians relocated, but there was a lone holdout, Cherokee Chief John Ross and his 20,000 men, women, and children who followed him resisted the Removal Act until the bitter end. What happened as a result of that, Luke Mortimer? When they refused to sign it, what did the government do? Moved them by force. Moved them by force. So as a result, approximately 20,000 resistant Cherokees, men, women, and children, were rounded up by the federal government and relocated at gunpoint. Relocated at gunpoint. All the rules were off. They didn't come under the Treaty of New Echota. They were going to be peacefully moved. Do you think the government was going to stick them in the side a little bit as well to show? Guess when they moved them? Middle of what? Winter. Moved them in the middle of the winter. So 20,000 resistant Cherokees, men, women, and children, were rounded up, and they were marched into Indian territory in the middle of the winter, resulting in approximately 25% of them dying along the way. 20,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were rounded up and relocated by force at gunpoint in the middle of the winter, which resulted in nearly 25% of the tribe perishing along the way. Now, according to Indian legend, and what does that mean? Indian legend. Could be true, might not be true, rumor, story, fact, whatever. According to Indian legend, during the march of the Cherokee, every place a tear fell from the tragedy, a flower grew. According to Indian legend, a flower of sadness grew in every spot that a tear fell on this march of death by the Cherokee to the Indian territory. According to Indian legend, a flower grew, a flower of sadness grew every time a tear dropped from this sad, destructive march. The name of that flower of sadness was called the Cherokee Rose. Cherokee Rose. Now this isn't a very good picture. I had it meant for it to be in color, but it's a white flower with a yellow inside. Kind of a pretty flower. And this Cherokee Rose, if you go and walk the trail that they took, you will see these Cherokee roses all the way down the trail. Ironically, guess which flower became the state flower of Georgia? The Cherokee Rose. Sad story, but true. So, if you walk that trail, even today, in which those people were marched forcefully, it would be covered with Cherokee rose all the way. And the Indian legend is that a flower of sadness grew in every spot a tear fell. Okay, that will take us then to the fate of the Seminole Indians, the only group we haven't talked about yet. The fate of the Seminole Indians of Florida. Now, remember they would, yeah, go ahead, my dear.
Is Nicholas still alive or was he captain?
Remember, he died at 14, so I'm trying to think, yeah, he would have been, yeah. We've been close, so let me think. Yeah, yeah. Hey, what's happening?
We were supposed to watch the Greater Crusades and we've already seen them. So Mr. Dorn is out of town and we wanted to know, do you have a movie that's during that time period about the Crusades and stuff?
Everything I have is U.S. history. I don't have a world history thing.
That's okay.
Yeah.
All right, we'll figure out something.
Yeah, I might have a short, who do you have in there, sophomores?
Yeah.
Show them this. It has nothing to do with history. It's 15 minutes long. Tearjerker,
Okay,
Arthur.
all right, sounds good. All right.
Have you seen, I showed you Arthur, haven't I? All right, see if they have a pulse over there. Anyway, the Seminole Indians took a little different approach when they were fighting with the government over the removal treaties. They simply went to war with the government. And this war between the Seminole Indians and the government became known in history as the Seminole War. And that thing was fought, and it didn't end until 1842. That was a long battle. So when we talk about the fate of the Seminole Indians of Florida, the failure of the Seminole Indians to sign the agreements led to what we know as the Seminole War between the Indians and the military. And this Seminole War lasted until 1842, when finally the Seminoles were defeated by the military. And when they were defeated, where'd they go? West. Obviously, they were moved forcefully west into Indian Territory. So, after their defeat, the Seminoles peacefully moved westward, with the exception of a small number of Seminoles who escaped and fled and hid somewhere, hoping never to be found and have to move. Anybody want to guess where they hid? Obviously you know what state they hid in, don't you? Where are the Seminoles from? Florida. So where'd they go that probably nobody had chased them into Florida? Very good, the Florida Everglades. So they basically escaped as many as they could. Wasn't a lot. And they moved into the Florida Everglades, which is a swampy, alligators-infested place, especially in those days. And they hoped never to be found. They actually were not. And they began to develop their community. You ever heard of the Florida State University Seminoles? That's where it came from. Because they went into the Florida Everglades and eventually continued their tribe and flourished there in later years. Some of the descendants of these people that we're talking about now still live there. Okay? So descendants of these first Seminoles. Now, there's a little bit of confusion on the term Trail of Tears. A lot of people think the Cherokee March that we talked about is the Trail of Tears. It was part of the Trail of Tears. Because here's what the Trail of Tears are. From 1830 to 1840, during that decade, from 1830 to 1840, there were approximately 80,000 Indians moved from lands east of the Mississippi to lands west of the Mississippi. Some were moved peacefully, some were moved by force. Several different Indian tribes, at least 5, during that 10-year period. During that march of those 80,000 people during that 10-year period, they have estimated that about or approximately 10,000 died during the march. That period, from 1830 to 1840, in which 80,000 Indians were relocated, resulting in approximately 10,000 deaths, that is known as the Trail of Tears. Not just the Cherokee March, but the entire Indian movement west from 1830 to 1840, that decade, during the time those 80,000 Native Americans were moved, resulting in about 10,000 deaths, that era in history is known as the Trail of Tears. Okay? Can you see why Native Americans do not have a big love of Andrew Jackson? And I think I told you this before. Go to the casino in Riverton, which is Native American, and see how many Native Americans carry $20 bills on them. Very few. Okay? They'll always have 5s or 10s. They will not carry 20s if they know the history at all. There couldn't be anybody more thrilled than Native Americans that the picture of Andrew Jackson is going to change on the $20 bill to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Isn't that the gal they picked? I believe. That's going to happen pretty quick. So keep that in mind. On the other hand, Andrew Jackson did not serve as president until 1840. So he's not the only president that allowed this to happen. He instigated it, but he wasn't the only president that allowed it to happen. So he cannot take full responsibility, but he can take most of it because he initiated it. But the other presidents didn't hesitate either. But they don't get near the criticism that he gets. Okay? All right, let's move to a new subtopic, back to politics, and we'll be going back in history a little bit and talk about the South Carolina nullification crisis. This is kind of an interesting story. And I think you, again, I'm not being political, but I think you'll see some parallels on decisions made by the president here that might parallel those that you might see President Trump make today. Anybody know anything about the South Carolina nullification crisis? I'd be kind of impressed if you did. Well, it happened during the Jackson presidency when the state of South Carolina was very upset about the high taxes that the United States was charging Great Britain to import goods into this country. The state of South Carolina was upset at the high taxes that the United States was charging Britain to bring products into our